Just because it's the way we do that, just some acknowledgements before I start. The results I'm going to show here tonight comes from two different projects. The one that we've been through together, socioeconomic impact of gay communities in the US, funded by the National Institute of Health, and another one that was funded by the French National Agency for Research on public-private interactions in the production of suburban areas with the Greater Paris Planning Agency. And it was a more policy-applied project. So I'm going to go back and forth between qualitative and quantitative data from both projects, and this you have to know first. To start this presentation, I want to give you first some backgrounds. Gay communities is an euphemism. Gated estates are a subset of a wider genre of enclave-style developments, better defined as privately governed and securitized neighborhoods. So gated communities are residential schemes organizing the governance and social structure with an interlocking of spatial, legal, and social systems. There have been predominantly spatial and morphological analysis that view gated communities as simply walled and gated residential neighborhoods. And I want to move beyond and to try to assess the significance of this kind of neighborhoods in the suburban or the peri-urban fabric. You have security systems, gates, and around-the-clock surveillance systems, and gated communities therefore represent a form of urbanism where public space has been privatized. They differ from condominiums, and I want to stress this. They differ from condominiums and secured apartment complexes because behind the gates they include shared areas and amenities which are elsewhere open to the public, like streets, parks, sidewalks, playgrounds, which is not the case with condominiums. So there are horizontal developments, and it has an impact on the cost of the infrastructure and the way the governance has to be arranged. Just to say a few words on this, you've seen recently in the news that there are gay communities almost everywhere, and in South Africa, for instance, with the Oscar Pistorius case, you've seen how these kind of neighborhoods are overwhelming, have spread in different large metropolitan areas over the world, in different contexts with different meaning. So I will just focus today on the French case and the US case, because I will not speak about South America or South Africa, because these are different contexts with different meanings, and that could be a rather different discussion. Legally speaking, all forms of residential enclosures rely on property rights arrangements implemented in property owners associations. This is what we call private urban governance. There are legal structures designed to exclude others, designed to exclude non-members, and the residents are tied to a common set of interests by contract. This is a sort of local democracy by contract that I will discuss. And the interesting point here is that the origin of this contractual democracy originated at the same time in France and in the US in the early 19th century. And there are common backgrounds in the US and in France. So important considerations from this perspective include the nature of ownership, the nature of the local governance, the nature of the management. And well, there are, for some of them, kind of pseudo-governance with tens of thousands of residents behind the gates. For instance, Leisure World in LA is a gated community of retired with 19,000 of residents living together behind gates. Average age is 77 for the residents. So that is to say that gated communities rely on securitization forms that are embedding social strategies to seek comfort and social homogeneity. And this is the other point I will stress. And therefore, researchers are focused on their impact on crime, segregation, property values, governance. So I move to the second point, and I have five. Point 2 is, what do we compare? What do I seek to compare tonight between France and the US? Comparing what? Well, I'm trying to develop some analytical tactics here. And I need to say a word on the vocabulary. I will often use the words exurban or peri-urban instead of suburban and banlieue. And this is of importance because tonight I'm not referring to the continuum of urban concentric sprawl. I'm not referring to the inner rings of the highly segregated boundaries of Paris. I am referring to, for the more contemporary thing, to the fragmented post-suburbia or the fragmented exurbia around Paris and around Los Angeles. So I am indeed referring to the areas that are defined as peri-urban and defined in terms of commuting patterns to workplaces instead of the concentric suburban areas. In this kind of peri-urban areas, two important facts have to be stressed. The first one is the fragmentation or splintering urbanism. Morphological fragmentation with subdivisions clustered and a lot of open space between subdivisions, so it's not a continuous urban sprawl. Fragmentation of the infrastructure and of the service provision for public transportation, for road, for infrastructure. There is a lot of fragmentation and political fragmentation and fiscal fragmentation. And this leads to a change in the way the peri-urban areas are governed, because there has been a rise of a grayness between private and public governance, between homeowners association and public governance. Well, to start with a good example, this is a picture of Canyon Lake. Canyon Lake is south of Omaha. It's in Riverside County, southeast of LA, and in Canyon Lake, this is a 9,500 residents gated community, which has a homeowner association. This is a homeowner association building, and you have a city hall, Canyon Lake City Hall, because this gated community has incorporated as a city of its own, as a municipal city of its own, back in 1991. And here you can figure out, just looking at the picture, that there is a grayness between the private governance of the neighborhood and the public governance of the city. They share the same buildings. They don't share the same office, but they communicate a lot. And well, the city is instrumental in managing the private area. And well, peri-urbanization, splintering suburbanization, is a development of a fragmented political space where there is this grayness between public and private management. And this is also the case in France. And this is the point I want to stress tonight. And it goes along with an increase of segregation patterns. So well, both are going together. So well, this is the kind of landscape that you have when you're in front of gated communities. You've seen the news with Oscar Pistorius, so we're very accustomed to that. But seen from above, you can tell in private neighborhoods nearby Paris, it's Bussy Saint-Georges, Villeneuve-Marne-la-Vallée, it's a new town, or here near Palm Springs in Riverside County, you can tell that the form, the morphology produced is the same, and the actors, the developers behind are also the same. So there is something from the house building industry that has also pushed towards this model of splintering of suburbanism. In both contexts, some corporations such as Kaufman and Broad, for instance, are major actors, and they have contributed to normalize the suburban landscape and to normalize the governance of the suburban landscape. So that I will discuss. So what I've been trying to do in the last maybe 10 years is to develop parallel analytical tactics in France and in the US. So it's not a strict comparison. Data are not the same, methodologies are not exactly the same, but we have developed analytical tactics to get a broader understanding of an issue that has a profound impact on the shaping of local contemporary democracy, with a shift toward what we call a home owner-based local democracy, or a shareholder democracy. You can put it as you want. So tonight, I defend the hypothesis that gated communities approach through different analytical tactics have much to say about the restructuring undergoing in the social fabrics of the periods, the local organization, and the production of space by groups, municipal governments, and shadow forms of governmental organization. So I will start with the object, and I move to the wider significance of the object. To put figures on this, what I am discussing about private urban governance is something that governs the lives of 20% of the population here in the US, whether in private neighborhoods or condominiums, homeowners associations, or the way of life for 20% of the population in the US. And a proportion of that in LA between 12 to 30%. A proportion of that lives in gated, private, securitized neighborhood. So when I say 30% of the development in Orange County, you have to imagine that it has a tremendous impact on the whole suburban fabric. It's not something anecdotal in the US. 30% of the subdivisions in Orange County, for instance. Well, and I have to say that in Paris, there are fewer gated enclaves, a lot fewer gated enclaves. And this is not a surprise. I mean, because you have ideas about the ideal romantical view of European cities as places where public spaces are of importance and where gated neighborhoods are supposed to be less attractive for prospective buyers. For the more recent period, this map shows the 64 gated neighborhoods built in the Paris area. This is downtown Paris, the first suburbs here, and the peri-urban areas of Ile-de-France. There are 64 gated communities have been built in Paris and its region since 1982, which is a very small number compared to the 200 and plus that I found in LA in 2003. It's more than actually 2,000 block groups that have gated streets inside. So, and it's hard to go beyond this scale, but you have an idea of the scale of the phenomenon. So it's not a very important phenomenon in Paris. It's a very important phenomenon in LA. But though there are connections that I would draw. Well, just to say a word about this, this is a socio-economic typology of Paris, based on, this is an economic typology, based on income of the households. In green, the more green the municipalities are, the richer they are, and also the more homogeneous they are in terms of income. You have to imagine that the greener the color is, the more concentrated the household above the 8th deciles are. And you have a huge concentration of the 20% of the richer population in the green areas, west of the metropolitan Paris. Well, in the reddish colors describe the poorer municipalities, the poorest municipalities. But when we say poor, that doesn't mean there is a concentration of the poor population. Some of the poor population is mixed with the middle class in the poor municipalities. That is to say that the golden ghetto are very much segregated and concentrated on the western side, and that the middle class is mixed with poor population here north of Paris, in the far eastern side, and well, in yellow colors you have the mix of the average middle class with a mix of every decile of incomes. So these are rather mixed municipalities. So what we see is that there is barely no gated communities in the richer dark green areas. There are already golden ghettos. They don't need gated neighborhoods. The municipality per se is already a gated neighborhood. And most of the blue dots are located within the yellow or light green areas, which are the average middle class. So what I have to say here is that there is something with this 64 gated neighborhood in Paris that have to connect to social distinction of the residents within municipalities which are overwhelmingly middle class and mixed middle class. There is something about social distinction here within the middle class for the more recent development. Well, moving to LA, it's a completely different story. Gated communities are located in the old neighborhoods in purple here, or here in Palm Springs. A lot of them here in Orange County, which are basically retirement communities or block groups with an overrepresentation of 65 plus. Owners, affluent, mostly white. But many of them, and actually 20% of them in LA County, are also located in the Asian middle class areas. 5% of them are located in, you can see it from where you are, in orange areas, which are Hispanic, owner-occupied, middle-class neighborhoods, and a lot of them, an overwhelming majority, are located in the white, suburban, property owners, 45 plus years old neighborhoods, which is on average 40% of the sample. So here in LA, gated communities recently built, the one we have surveyed in the exurbs, are located within richer, whiter, older neighborhoods, even though there is a diffusion of gated enclaves to Asian middle class and Hispanic middle class neighborhoods at the same time. So, but there are different products targeting niche markets in these different areas. So here's for the landscape. So, well, I moved back in the this is part of the analytical tactic. Where does it come from? This object, this product, and why this comparison between France and the US? As you see from the maps and the typology, the contexts are very different. And if we just stick to the typology that I showed you, gated communities in France have nothing to do with gated communities in LA. And well, this can be a rather common understanding. So let's move back to the history. And this is part of my practice. And a genealogy of gated communities, a discussion of common origins, common grounds. So, well, private urban governance originated in the 19th century in industrial European cities such as London and Paris, where the new industrial bourgeoisie of the 19th century sought in privately operated and enclosed suburban neighborhoods a quiet retreat from the busy city center of blue collars and industry workers. That was a basic element. And this is one of the earliest examples. This one is the Parc de Montretout. Parc de Montretout in Saint-Cloud, west of Paris. Very nice view over the Eiffel Tower and the Seine River. It has been developed in 1832, and it's probably the first of its kind, if we're looking to real gated community. And it was developed as a 250 large gated neighborhoods with a homeowner association, and it was the first model of this romantic suburbia of the bourgeoisie that has later been adopted in the US, with, for instance, Llewellyn Park in New Jersey, which was built in 1854, if I remember well. So 20 years after. You have in the US, here is an example in LA, it's the flyer of the developer, the adoption of this kind of romantic suburban model of living for the bourgeoisie and the elite of the movie industry in LA, in Rolling Hills. Very nice location near the Pacific Ocean. It's a neighborhood built on a ranch with a lifestyle associated to the houses, which is a horse riding lifestyle. It's a ranch, they like horse riding. This kind of neighborhood was the kind of the first ones developed in Southern California in the early 20th centuries, 1930s, 1940s. But it has used the same model than the one in Montretout or the one in Llewellyn Park, New Jersey, which is a private gated neighborhood. There used to be a gate in Llewellyn Park for the chain that was a barrier on the access road, and the private urban governance with an association managing all the amenities, all the facilities, all the infrastructures inside. So, well, here on this slide, I'm trying to sum up the different influences that comes together to explain the rise of gay communities here in the US. So, first one is the romantic suburbia in green, the green arrow. This is the romantic suburbia with the very first example of Monde the romantic suburbia from the mid-19th century. And it turned out that this is a model that Ebersner Howard adopted to shape the model of the residential utopia of the garden cities. And garden cities have always been in urbanism some kind of a background model for a kind of utopian suburban living, close to the nature, with intersection between living blocks and nature and parks. The other trend comes from the exclusivity of a neighborhood and the historical process that brought common interest developments, private urban governance, and exclusionary restrictive covenants from Europe to the US. The first homeowners association was set up in France in 1804 with the Napoleon Civil Code, and you have to know maybe that this condominium law, which is in the Civil Code in 1804 in France, has been adopted by Puerto Rico for condominiums in Puerto Rico, and then the Puerto Rico condominium law had been adopted as a US law in 1961 in the US condominium law. So there has been this kind of transition between a European legal system translated into an American legal system through Puerto Rico. This is very well documented by Mackenzie. He is a lawyer from the University of Chicago, and he has documented this legal process of adoption of a legal model from France and Spain and Europe to Puerto Rico to the US. And this adoption of the legal system was observable in London, and it was adopted for Erin Park, and then in St. Louis, Missouri, in 1867, where they implemented private streets to keep up with the maintenance of streets. And it has been implemented in a big neighborhood based on exclusivity and lifestyle for the first time in Ocean Grove, 1869. This is on the Atlantic coast, south of Atlantic City, I think.
No, right next to Asbury Park.
Oh, it's perfect. So it's closer than I imagined. I've never been there actually, so thank you for the question. It was a community. Ulyss Grant used to be a member, and I think
Well, it's a Methodist.
It's a Methodist. It's based on faith. It's a Methodist gay community. It used to have a homeowner association, and you had to belong to the church to be part of the community and to be a member of the club. So this links the community to social selection, the legal process, and the exclusionary process together. And this is where it has been really implemented for the first time, all together. And well, there are other trends. And the last trend I want to focus on is security. Security is the latest trend embedded into gay community, and it started late, very late, back in 1972 with Oscar Newman and crime prevention through urban design theories back in 1972, what he calls defensible space. And I will move to this a little bit later. So what we have to imagine here is that there is this different series of influences coming together in a mass consumption product in the 70s in Los Angeles, with different influences, some of them coming from Europe and some of them actually coming from France. And Haskell's for example, did the trip several times between France and the US, and was one of the conveyor of this historical model. Well, I moved back to Paris because while this was happening in the US, what was happening in Paris? In Paris, as I said, the model of private urban governance was included in the Civil Code in 1804. So it's not a surprise to see that in Paris you have all these black dots everywhere. There are more than 1,500. All these black dots are villas or private streets that were built in Paris at the end of the 19th century. Like the Villa Montmorency. Villa Montmorency in the 16th district. Home of André Gide, home of Henry Bergson, and home of Carla Bruni Sarkozy. And so this kind of areas of private streets were developed by developers in what was then the suburban areas of Paris. Because they are located in the outer districts. Most of them are located in the outer districts. The 13th, the 12th districts, the 19th district here, and the 16th districts, which were in 1861 still overwhelmingly rural areas with villages, and private streets were a way to organize.
These are the arrondissements, right? The districts in Paris?
Yes, arrondissement or district. So you have this first trend, and then you also have in red and white here in the outskirts a first set of gated developments which have been developed in the early 20th century, in the first suburbs of Paris in the 20th century. So this is Parliament 2. This was built in the 40s, 1940s. This was built in the 50s and 60s in the Bièvre Valley, south of Paris. And there were early prototypes of gated developments. And as you can see, this is not something overwhelming like here in LA, like in LA with huge developments. There are small gated private streets.
Are these the parks, the aristocratic parks that were developed in the suburban areas, or are they developed in the gated communities, the aristocratic parks?
The aristocratic parks, they are here, and here.
Okay.
The
So these are different.
These are the prototypes. And these are private streets. And many of them were blue collars private streets. Blue collars private streets. Working class villas. Small developments built by worker unions. And for instance, the railway union built dozens of private streets south of the 13th district for the worker. They were assigned with a lottery to the workers, and they had to develop their own house, their own housing, with some requirement, with some restrictions. So the houses were developed basically by architects for the blue collars, because they had to abide to some kind of restrictions to build this. Yeah, yes.
But now they're highly desirable, aren't they?
Yes, many of them are highly desirable. And gentrification occurred in the 50s there. Just after World, just in the 50s, gentrification.
They're charming views of the streets, the little houses that they're at.
Because they were built in the 1890s to the 1930s. So, you know, at the turn of the 1960s, they were all either dead or retired. So the gentrification process there occurred way before the actual gentrification process that we know. So, well, this is part of the whole history of gated process here in Paris, which is something very common and very obvious. So, well, I moved to another thing. I'll move back to this one later. Gating and enclosing a neighborhood. Yeah, I have to move quickly. Is a way to securitize a neighborhood into what we call the club economy. Let me give you a sense of what it is. The gated street model was theorized by Oscar Newman in 1972 as a desirable model to avoid urban decay in his defensible space set of theories. What the basic assumptions of Oscar Newman are here on the right for you, yeah. Gated streets enhance feeling of property by residents and tenants. Gated streets guarantee the exclusive use of a private site and amenities in order to prevent any free riding and unwanted visitor. And any free rider using the infrastructures, your park, your street, your parking lot, which is of importance. And so, by doing so, it ultimately protects property values against urban decay, because you control the neighborhood, you socially control the neighborhood with a gated street, and enhancing the feeling of property over the street, over the shared amenities, ultimately enhance the whole neighborhood and better protects, is supposed to better protect property values over time. Well, this protection of property values is a common set of arguments for the developers. And when you buy in a gated community, the real estate agent will say, well, this is a good investment because it's gated, you're going to protect your investment. And this is a basic discourse of real estate agents. But there is also a discourse by city officials. The government has backed such discourse. Two things. Oscar Newman defensible space hypothesis have been included in a report in 1996 of the US Department of Housing and Urban Development, and this report, which was widely disseminated, stipulates that gated streets are a tool to avoid urban decay and to protect property values, according to Oscar Newman hypothesis. And this report came to France by the means of dozens of reports written by French colleagues, I have the names, Sophie Baudy-Gendreau, Gonzalo, whoever, who have published for French planning authorities report on the experience of defensible space in the US, and they make recommendations for gating streets to improve local control of the residents, which has been done. Here is a picture. This is a small residential street which has been gated here. And this is the other side of the street, to protect this street from the through traffic coming from the social housing district located nearby. So the street closing has been designed to protect the local residents from the through traffic coming from the social housing. That was the goal, and that was designed by the municipality with the resident and the Suburban Association to do that. So the thing that you have to know is that the picture is located here in Coubron. Coubron is this very quiet municipality north of the Seine-Saint-Denis, right? And this is very close to Montfermeil and Clichy-sous-Bois. Remember that in Clichy-sous-Bois and Montfermeil 2005, this is where the riots started. And Coubron tried to protect itself from the huge subsidized social housing from Clichy-sous-Bois and Montfermeil, and they adopted dozens of gated streets here in Coubron. But as you can see, they are protected from the social housing by a huge forest. So there is this double gating system. This double a green belt and then a sub-gating system inside the municipality. Well, this was brought back from the US by the means of dozens of reports read and implemented by local urban agencies and municipal governments. So this is just to discuss the impact of gated communities as theories to protect neighborhoods back to France. And well, it's amazing to see how in urbanism we reinvent models, because the origin of the gated streets came from the reports from Oscar Newman. It doesn't originate in a replication of what was originally done in Paris. And they don't have a clue there are a lot of private streets done in Paris, because it's very different. So well, there is this going back and forth of information.
Is the forest protected that you pointed out? The large forest?
Oh, the large forest is protecting a lot, yes. Because it's 3 or 4 kilometers wide, and you don't cross the forest. You just walk into the neighborhood. So,
but they can build on it.
No, it's a protected forest. So the whole idea is that this green belt is a protection against urban sprawl and against the sprawl of social housing towards this more middle class, nice suburb of Rouen. So does it protect property values? Yes. And this is what we've done with this map. In red, you have the areas where property values have increased in gated areas between 1980 and 2008. And in light red, you have the areas where gated communities have, where residential communities, property values have increased between 1980 and 2000 and have unfortunately slightly decreased because of the foreclosure crisis. But throughout the last 30 years, the property values have hugely increased and the foreclosure crisis has not consumed the increase in value in these areas. And well, they are recovering pretty fast in these areas. So well, if we map gated communities and property values increase together, they work well to protect property values, whereas in other areas, especially in dark gray, there has been a decrease of property value, of relative property values in ungated areas between 1980 and 2008. The table say the same. So this theory of governing a gated enclave as a club to protect the property value works. And so what is the club economy? The picture says it all. This is Manhattan Village in LA, just south of Los Angeles International Airport. It's very close to LAX. And Manhattan Village, you have a gate here, one gate, a direct access to a private golf with this country club here, and direct access to different amenities here, sport amenities. What is a club economy? Well, it's a way to manage with gates and enclosure the public goods that are behind the gates, and to manage it collectively. Gated communities are to be understood as territorial clubs. They select their residents and they are governed by small publics of the residents, and together they have a shared interest to govern properly this small area, which is entirely made of private space. And to sustain this club economy, there is an exclusionary mechanism of membership. That means that there is a very precise relationship between payment and benefits received, payments made by the owners, with a very high entry cost. The entry cost is very high. Usually you have to pay 10% to 20% more than the average price to live in the gated community for the same thing. And this is the entry price. And what you receive for that entry price is privately owned amenities, basically, and exclusions of free riders. So what this club economy is building is increased segregation. And this is where I move to this building of homogeneity. So, and I take 5 minutes to cover this. Yeah. The residential clubs can be analyzed with different and different levels, and different levels, social levels. What we've done here was to capture the permutations of the fabrics of the neighborhood through a multivariate principal component analysis. Well, anyway, we have extracted 4 major axes on which segregation is organized, and these axes are hierarchized because of the respective statistical significance. So the first factor for segregation here in LA, and this is the map of Orange County, is ethnicity and economic status. So in the reddish color you have wealthy white population, more than 40 years old, with honor status. And here you have more Hispanic population, younger population, with lower economic profiles. And what we have analyzed is what I call noodles. You see all the noodles here on the maps? The noodles are the social distance index. The wider the noodle is, the fatter the noodle is, the more social distance there is between 2 adjacent neighborhoods. Here, between these 2 areas, you have a noodle, which is here, and you see that there is a significant shift in neighborhood composition between this neighborhood and that neighborhood.
Based on ethnicity.
Yeah, based on ethnicity and economic status alone, which is the first factor. So here, if we consider gated communities compared to other non-gated neighborhoods, on economic status and ethnicity, white versus Hispanic, the gated communities built a segregation which is 1.5 more important in significance than what we usually see between 2 adjacent neighborhoods. Compared to 2 classical adjacent neighborhoods, a gated community is likely to segregate more by 1.5% on this level. Let's move to the second factor, which is life cycle and home ownership. Life cycle, which is age, linked to the home ownerships. In green, more owners and older population. In purple, less owners and younger population. You have the noodles here around gated communities, and gated communities are likely to segregate 1.4 times more than what we usually see between 2 adjacent neighborhoods. The interesting thing comes here. Factor 4, which is age polarization. Everything being equal in terms of income and ownership. So this is age segregation alone. And there, because we have a lot of retirement gated communities, you can see that the noodles are very fat. Which means that gated communities segregate on average 3.6 times more between adjacent neighborhoods than what we usually see between 2 non-gated adjacent neighborhoods. So there is a tremendous impact on gated communities on segregation by age and segregation by income and status, which was the first one. So let's talk about race. How is this segregating race? And this is the fourth factor of the analysis, the fourth factor in order, in hierarchy of statistical significance, is racial segregation, everything being equal in terms of income and in terms of ownership. And it separates Asian, Black, and white, non-Hispanic, to level of the scale. And you can see that the noodles here are barely significant. Noodles, Because gated communities are located within already very homogeneous neighborhoods in terms of racial composition. So gated communities do not segregate by race because they are located within already very segregated municipalities or environment. So this is something that we brought together, that gated communities are not building segregation by race because they just implement the use of they are located within already very homogeneous areas, segregated by land use, by public policy, in terms of racial segregation. And so, with this picture in mind, I moved to the conclusion: what's happening in France? Why are there so few gated communities in only 62? I said at the very beginning, built after 1992, although it used to be an overwhelming phenomenon in the early 20th century. So what happened? Well, what happened is that suburbanization, or peri-urbanization, is something in France that brings a new political organization that renders gating meaningless. The point I want to stress here is that because of the municipal governance, you don't need gated communities in suburban areas in France. Why? And this is a crucial point. Why? Well, the actual situation differs from the commonly perceived image of France as a centralized country. And I want to stress this. This image was very pertinent in the 60s, but it's not longer the fact. And at the beginning of the 80s, decentralization has been such that very small municipalities have been empowered with new responsibilities in terms of planning and land use. And you have to imagine, to have a picture of what's happening. Here, in the outskirts of the suburban region, the peri-urban areas in pink, there are small municipalities with 2 or 3 subdivisions of single family owner-occupied houses. And these municipalities with subdivisions have an average population of 820 inhabitants. Let's say 800 inhabitants as an average population, which is to be compared with the average population of a gated development in the US, which is 300. And so this is a matter of scale. Municipalities in peri-urban areas in France are small enough to be governed as clubs, to implement the social selection, to implement through design, planning, requirements, local regulation, the strategies they need to select the resident, to have rigorous policy, to avoid public housing, because they are small enough to do that, and to be governed as clubs, which have services and amenities for small public, exactly as they do in gated communities here in the US. So maybe the success of gated communities in the US is that the scale of public governance is 10,000. To incorporate as a city, you need to have more than 5 or 10,000 inhabitants, depending on the state, basically. Well, in France, to be incorporated as a municipality, 50% are enough because municipalities existed before. They were created after the French Revolution. So municipalities are very small and are sufficient in building the local protection the residents want. And in the US, some have to use private urban governance and gates to implement these tools for local control, while in France, the municipality itself gives enough local power to 800 inhabitants to do it. I'll show you this impact of land use and regulation. You have here south of Autoroute A13, Autoroute de Normandie, west of Paris. 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 municipal governments. See this number of subdivisions. We just have a few number of subdivisions adjacent to the different municipalities, and all of them are municipalities. And through land use regulation, through state regulation, they escape the requirement for public housing. They don't have to implement any public housing, and they are free to restrict the access to open land, to maintain green belt and maintain slow growth policy, which will help to shape local clubs and to shape the social homogeneity that the suburban residents are looking for. So, well, this is basically the end of the story for us tonight. And for me, I will stop and write that. There has been a common history of big development in the US and in France, but the roads, the paths have separated because of the scale of governance and the way that the local governance was organized. But I want to stress that with this shaping of municipal governance in France, this grayness I was mentioning at the beginning, this grayness between public and private management is everywhere, because the subdivisions you see here are owners associations. So, well, you have the same grayness of local governance and a broad boundary between public authorities and private governance. Thank you.